welcome to this installment of our plant engineering video conversation. I'm your host, Amara Rozgus, editor-in-chief of Plant Engineering, and I've connected with Jeremiah Woodward at Verusen. This is part of the Maintaining Your Plant Floor Edge video series, which focuses on maintenance from a lot of different angles. Thanks for joining me today, Jeremiah.
Happy to be here. And it's Woodford, just to be clear.
Woodford, got it. Thank you. Well, here's some background about my guest. MRO industry veteran Jeremiah Woodford is Verusen's Chief Revenue Officer, responsible for leading the entire sales process, including revenue and sales pipeline creation, market development, and sales operation. Jeremiah brings more than a decade of sales leadership experience in asset-intensive industries, MRO, and supply chains. So maintenance, repair, and operation, or MRO, is important for many reasons. Jeremiah, first, let's start. What was the objective of this survey?
I think the main objective that we wanted to push out there was to see what large enterprise organizations are doing today and how they're viewing their, if any, strategic initiatives around how they view and manage their MRO inventory and how they view it from supply chain to procurement to maintenance operations. At least in my experience, 20 plus years in heavy industry, mainly in oil and gas and mining, come from a maintenance background. Maintenance spare parts are really important. Stocking those maintenance spare parts are really important to the maintenance teams to make sure they have the right spare parts when they need them. But from a procurement supply chain standpoint, it is kind of a black box on, are we buying the right parts? Are we buying enough of the right parts? Are we buying too much of the wrong parts? And trying to understand how the organizations are trying to align to figure out those essentially complicated problems.
Okay. That all makes sense. Was there anything surprising that you found in this study?
That a vast majority of the respondents are not using any specific tools outside of your standard ERP or EAM or warehouse management systems to strategically source this material or stock this material. And what I mean by that is that, of course, your EAM software, your enterprise ERP software like your SAPs and your Maximo products out there do a good job of putting your master data catalogs in and in storing and buying that material. But when it comes to trying to determine is this the right amount of material we're buying and when should we be buying it and how much should we be stocking and storing and what our reorder points are, those products have continuously failed year over year. They don't have any algorithms or any advanced capabilities to determine is this min-max, this reorder point correct? Is the criticality of the spare part correct? In my experience, Maximo is a binary scenario. Maximo is one of your most popular used EAM systems in the industry, SAP being the most used ERP, and most of our customers use both of those quite frequently for their managing of their maintenance and the repair and the operations and their inventory. And both of those products go essentially a binary viewpoint of inventory. And what I mean by that is that if it's critical, then it's a checkbox that it's indicated that this spare part is critical. When you have a binary viewpoint of inventory that way, then everything ultimately becomes critical. And then ultimately, when everything's critical, nothing's critical from a procurement standpoint.
Yeah, so it sounds like there are a lot of obstacles, there are a lot of challenges. What's the biggest one? What's the biggest challenge to implementing better MRO practices?
Aligning those three organizations. I've worked from the largest, from ExxonMobil to Dow Chemical to the largest mining companies, BHP, in my past. And every time it's always the same. And the industries are agnostic in a sense, from manufacturing to upstream oil and gas. They're all the same in the structure is that maintenance, supply chain, and procurement never really sit into a room and align on what is the strategy. What is really important to the maintenance teams not everything is important, and not rationalizing. So there's a give and take, and getting those strategies down and understanding what those strategies are is really important for production, uptime, but also to the bottom line of the business. So procurement and supply chain, they have KPIs aligned to making sure they buy from the lowest price suppliers. They have KPIs tied to trying to negotiate better pricing deals. Their KPIs are trying to, their fiduciaries' responsibility is not to overspend the company's money. And the maintenance teams, their responsibility is to keep the plants and the assets up and running. And those two are diametrically opposed in that approach. So when maintenance looks at inventory, they really are not going at a scientific method and saying, is this min-max for this critical spare part correct? We just want to, from a maintenance perspective, we just want to make sure when there's a breakdown, that part's available. And the only time they ever really revisit that min-max is when there wasn't a part available. And so they got in trouble because it got prolonged. And so they had to expedite a part out. And so anytime they revisit that min-max, they went and they just double those min-maxes typically. And that's typically been the strategy. And it's no strategy at all, really. It's just making sure you have coverage. But what's happened over the years is now you're talking about a $1 trillion problem and across the globe. And most of these companies are carrying massive amounts of surplus inventory just because these three organizations aren't sitting down into a room and aligning on a methodology, specifically a methodology to determine these are really critical spare parts, these are less critical. And then, all right, so if this is really, really critical spare part, and then supply chain can come in and say, well, I can source this from 4 vendors and I can get it right across the street. So I understand maintenance operations, it's really important, but we can source it really easily. Let's come together on what is the middle of the road compromise here, and not, carry 5 years of supply for this part. And it's the rationale of that. But that in itself goes down a rabbit hole of how do you actually when most organizations that we're dealing with are carrying hundreds of thousands of individual parts in their warehouses. So, a typical master data catalog that we see are somewhere in the hundreds of 200,000. We have customers that have 1 million cataloged items. And so how do you, as a human being, how would you even chip away at that? And so that's where tools like what Verusen does really can help rationalize and focus your team's time on where their focus should be on the most critical spare parts or the surplus parts that essentially they've got way too much of. I'll give you an example. You may have a min-max of 10 and 11 and of a bearing, and that bearing gets issued out on a work order because it failed on a pump. Okay, great. So then that maintenance guy gets the bearing, goes and fixes it, but now you triggered a reorder, and now you went and ordered another bearing, and so to get back up to 11, but you've got a safety stock of 10 essentially, and maybe that bearing only moves once a year. So do you really need 10 bearings for something that's moving once a year? And so but it's hard for anyone. So like when you do that at one item level, but if you think about that, if you've got 100,000 materials to review, it's almost impossible, humanly impossible, to do that in a timely fashion, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Yeah. Communication is key here, obviously. And then tracking all of that.
Exactly.
So it sounds like you have a lot of different examples. What are some of the areas that the fastest inroads are happening? Or tell me about positive stuff.
Yeah, I think that the coolest thing that we're seeing right now this year specifically is the explosion of AI. So I guess the best way I can articulate this is last year, ChatGPT really blew up the market from a generative AI and in large language models and what they could potentially do for big organizations. And a number of big companies that we're working with today called in all the big AI providers, from Microsoft to OpenAI to all the C3 AIs of the world. And actually a big customer, a big oil and gas customer working with today, had a really good story. The CEO said, I want them all to come in and give us a pitch, present what this technology can do for us. And what they came away from was like, these are generalized platforms that it's really hard to articulate the value that AI can unlock until it could take years of workshopping and pilots to unlock. And then they found us, and we are 100% an AI solution, a large language model built, but it's purposely built for this one problem. And that problem is optimizing maintenance spare parts and making better. Our whole goal is to make better decisions, better pricing, and sharing of inventory within organizations. And so that's what we built a large language model with a joint venture with Georgia Tech over 8 years ago. It's taken about $25 million of investment to get this thing stood up and working. And we've ingested 40 million individual parts, SKU parts, in addition to 200 billion transactions to get this thing intelligent, if that makes any sense. But it's like a savant, I guess is the best way to articulate. It only knows maintenance spare parts. It only knows the naming conventions, and it only knows and it's been trained specifically to solve this problem. And so when we've been getting brought into a lot of organizations that have AI budgets that have went out, they've set out, we have a number of AI initiatives, and this is right up their alley in the sense of like it's meant to solve one particular problem. That's what and this is a tangible problem, not some nebulous, give us all of your data from all of your systems, and then we'll come back and tell you all the problems that we have found, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah, highly specialized. All right, so back to the survey for a second here. If there is one thing that you would like people to take away from that survey, what would that be?
I think that's a good question. I think the biggest strategies that people aren't doing, but the people that are actually leveraging specifically around criticality. What we see is, and what we hope that some of the takeaways on the survey was how people are leveraging not even software, but processes to articulate and agree in an organization a criticality process for spare parts. In most of your regulated industries, most everyone's going to have a methodology, especially from reliability teams, to assign criticality to your assets and your equipment. But most organizations haven't gone to the next level to define that same methodology for spare parts. And I can't stress enough that the importance of that, once you as an organization, not just maintenance and reliability, but supply chain as well, come together and determine a methodology of assigning criticality to spare parts. And again, not a binary checkbox that it is critical, but an ABCDE code method. And in a real ideal world, a routine way to audit that methodology. So if you've got that bearing and that bearing has been issued to that most critical pump, then that bearing adopts that asset criticality. But then you have subtleties to that and shades of gray in the sense of that you can buy that bearing from 3 different vendors, your lead time's less than a day, then have a methodology that can demote that criticality. That all goes to your stocking strategies. But at the end of the day, knowing what's most important in these industries is for people to easily be able to say, these spare parts are our most critical spare parts. And understanding what those are. Because out of that 100,000 that most of these customers are holding, there's only going to be like 1,000 of those that are really critical typically.
And that was Jeremiah Woodford at Verusen, talking about several topics related to MRO, specifically research that was released recently. Thanks, Jeremiah. It was such a pleasure to chat with you. And for more information on maintaining your plant for edge, predictive or preventive maintenance, or other MRO topics, please visit Plant Engineering at www.plantengineering.com. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye.